In the name of the risen Christ, amen. So before he was a saint, he was a soldier. I'm talking, of course, about St. Francis, whose feast day is today, October the 4th. And under normal circumstances, we might all be looking forward to blessing animals and praying for those animals we've lost out in the garden after church at some point. Because, of course, Francis is the patron saint of animals and of the environment. And we're used to see him pictured, often with a bird on his shoulder or a lamb at his feet, because he was a gentle saint. But before he was a saint, he was a soldier, and not a very good one. I think it's safe to say that Francis, the soldier, considered himself to be a failure. Francis would have been about 21 years old when the nearby city of Perugia in Umbria in Italy attacked his hometown, Assisi. I believe the subject was money. It was the year 1202, more than 800 years ago. But he was 21 or 22, and he went off to war with his father's blessing, and likely with a beautiful horse and silken colors and the best sword that money could buy, because his father was a wealthy silk merchant in Assisi and very proud. So Francis went off to war, but things quickly turned bad for him, and he was in fact taken prisoner. We don't quite know the custom of the time. It's likely that he was held in a cave or perhaps in a pit, but the Perugians kept him for over a year. Finally, his father used his money to ransom him and bring him home in disgrace. Francis tried another time to go to war, this time on behalf of Pope Innocent III in the south of Italy, and this time he gave up on his own accord. He wasn't taken prisoner, but somehow it came to him that the soldier's life was not for him. And again he went home, but not in a good way. I think today we would likely agree that he had post-traumatic stress disorder from his imprisonment. What we do know for sure is that he was sick. It was either malaria or perhaps tuberculosis. He was miserable. So when Francis began the life of prayer that we associate with him, he may well have been hiding, because he was very much depressed and disappointed in himself, feeling that he had dishonored his family and his community and himself. He was hiding out in churches, and he was praying a lot. Now, they say that visions came to him in this time, that demons came to him in this time. He clearly had insomnia. He likely had nightmares. But during this period of withdrawal, when he was praying on one particular day in the chapel of San Damiano, down the hill in Assisi, toward the bottom of the hillside, he heard Christ speaking to him from the beautiful crucifix before which he knelt. He heard Christ saying, "Francis, repair my church. Repair my church." As the legend has it, Francis looked around himself and saw that, in fact, the church in which he prayed was falling down around him. It needed a lot of work. He took some money that he had, money he owed to his father for a recent sale that he had done. And instead of taking the money to his father, he bought stone, which he himself began to lay to repair the walls. When that money ran out, he began to beg in town for other money to buy more stone, which he was carrying up and down the hillside, until they say he was covered in the dust from the stones. He wore a rough robe that someone had given him. People in Assisi thought he was crazy. His father wrote him off for a fool or worse, but he kept at it. After about 2 years, it came to Francis one day as he was praying again and listening to the homily in a mass that Jesus might have meant something other than the building when he said, "Repair my church." Because when Francis thought of the church more in the abstract, as the organization, the body, the institution, he could see that it too was crumbling. The clergy had grown indolent, a little badly attached. The money was being spent down for wars and for wine. The sacrament was being disregarded. He felt there was little true penance and little faith. So he began to preach. And somewhere in there, as he began to preach, he also began to gather a following. Young men came quickly to join him, some older than he. Bernard was the first, and then Peter, then Sylvester, then Leo. There were more. They called themselves the Friars Minor, the little brothers of the poor. Francis vowed to own nothing. That old saying about how he'd give you the shirt off his back was literally true. He had the one robe, but he didn't consider that he owned it, and he would gladly lend it to someone who he felt needed it more. So he gave up, quite literally, his inheritance as the son of the silk merchant. And he gave up all that he had. And others began to join him in this same fashion of life. One who came to join him was a young woman, a beautiful young woman, who lived on the Piazza San Rufino in Assisi. Her name in Italian was Chiara or Clare. She went out through, we think, maybe a tiny door in the front of her house on the evening of Palm Sunday one year to join him. She went dressed as a bride and came away in a poor robe, having cut her beautiful red hair. She and her sisters who gathered to her would become to be known as the Poor Clares. So they had this commitment to living in poverty. Both of them, both Clare and Francis, as well as some of the other brothers. Some of them could have laid claim to enormous wealth. They surrendered it, they gave it up, and embraced poverty, embraced the cold, if you will, as an asset to their lives of prayer. We so often think of Francis as a joyful character. It's true that he was an acrobat, a singer, perhaps a juggler, and certainly a lover of animals. There was a playful characterization in many of the legends about him, but it's clear that the darkness, the discouragement, and the lack of confidence he felt after being a soldier lingered with him. He was frustrated as he tried to lead the friars, feeling that he really wasn't cut out to lead an organization. But the numbers grew wherever he went, whatever he did. He could not fail. He felt that he was not a leader, surely not an administrator. He stepped down from leadership as often as he could. He did not want to be lifted up in any way. He didn't even like to ride the donkey, they found him, preferring to walk until he became too sick to do that. It's funny, he gave up everything the world had to offer. And he felt himself to be an utter failure. And yet everything returned to him. He went out lonely and alone, and hundreds came to follow him. When Francis grew ill and knew that death was coming, he told his brothers that he did not want them to build any sort of church or shrine around him, that in fact he wanted to be buried in the town dump outside the city wall, a burial ground for criminals and murderers. So when he did die on October the 4th, 1226, they kind of honored his wish, but not. He was indeed buried outside the wall. And then they built a tomb over and around him. And over that tomb, they built the great Basilica of San Francis, one of the most beautiful and grandest churches in the world. He gave up everything, and everything returned to him. He went out lonely and alone, and others followed. Jesus said, "Whoever loses his life for my sake and the gospel will find it." Jesus said, "Give, and it will be given to you. A good measure, pressed down, shaken together, running over, will be put into your lap, for the measure you give will be the measure you get back." Francis gave it all. What can we make of this friend from 800 years ago? Well, we're certainly living in a time when we are either experiencing or fearing poverty in a way we haven't in a long time. And we have lost very much. Much has been taken from us in this pandemic. Loved ones and friends have died. Much of our customs of gathering, of coming together for weddings, funerals, baptisms, for church, have been diminished. We've withdrawn for the sake of our health and that of others. Some of us have lost our livelihoods. And whether we have enough cash and food or not, we are feeling ourselves somewhat at a loss. But can we claim that, embrace it, and love it as if we had given freely of our own accord for the love of God and for the gospel? Whoever loses his life for my sake, whoever loses her life for my sake and the gospel, will find it. Among the things, the jobs, the activities, the people you've lost over the last 6 months, can you think of that this week and find a way to make good use of the way that you have come? The learning that you have now, that there are many things you thought you needed that you now can do without. Years ago, a friend, Minka Sprague, who's now a priest, was working at the cathedral as I was. The Oyster Bar in Grand Central Station was closed. This is a long time ago now, I think in the 90s. It was closed and we all thought it was gone forever. Well, who knew that it was one of Minka's favorite places on the planet? But talking about the closure, she said, "I must have what I need. I must have what I need." Maybe through God's grace, even though we have less and can do less, we have what we need, and we can freely go and serve and love as Francis and Clare did. Amen.